Hello, everyone, and welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against threats posed by gender identity ideology. Many of us have been active feminists in the 1970s or even the 60s. We were not surprised when this new attack on women came along, and we have not changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position, and it has been signed by 39,998 people from 160 countries, and it is supported by 552 organizations. To promote the Declaration on Sex-Based Rights for Women, we have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Please join us. You can also become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. You can learn more about these possibilities by emailing info@womensdeclaration.com or via your country contact, which is publicized on the website womensdeclaration.com. Our program today is very interesting as usual. We're going to be hearing from sisters in Europe and in Latin America. We will have first Clarice Saadi from Brazil. She will tell us about Brazil being the new hotbed of trans insanity. And later on, we will hear from Italy. We will have Mara Accettura telling us about the family in the woods and other news from Italy. We will finish the webinar by having a video that is an extract from the CSW webinar that WDI ran some days ago, coinciding with the CSW event of the UN. Clarice is one of the directors of MATRIA, a Brazilian women's association that fights against the erosion of women's sex-based rights in her country. Thank you very much for being with us, Clarice. Welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I started my activist life here on WDI, helping organize those webinars, Feminist Question Time. I stayed for almost a year. And at that time, I refused every time Joe asked me to host because I was so scared of being on camera. So I've come a long way. And I'm happy to now be here as one of the directors of MATRIA to tell you about what's going on in Brazil. I know that the rest of the world is far from getting over what's going on with trans activism, but still we see progress, while in Brazil things seem to be getting worse and worse. And so I want to start by a famous quote in Brazil that says that really bad ideas, when they get old, they come to die in Brazil. So that's the feeling we have, that things will get better everywhere else and still go on in Brazil for a while. I also think there's a market issue there, that when markets start closing for gender ideology and everything they sell with it in the global north, they will need to push it in other places. And Brazil is, of course, a huge market. And when you think about the fact that we have a national health public system like you do in the UK, that can be a very big profitable market for pushing hormones, for example. So, but I'm going to start telling you a bit about MATRIA, my organization. We were founded in 2023, almost 3 years ago now. We are a legally constituted group, women only. And I think that what really made things possible for us is that we are constituted as an association, meaning that women who join, they pay a small monthly fee. And that's how we manage to support all our actions. We are completely self-funded. We get some donations from time to time, but that's it. So it's very funny that trans activists in Brazil, the more we get big, the more they come with conspiracy theories that we are funded by the far right, the UK's far right, I have heard. And recently I've heard that we're funded by the Middle East, like that, like the entity, the Middle East. I don't know what that means, but we are non-partisan. So we make an effort to have and accept all women from all walks of life. And it's been a very interesting experience because the world is so polarized nowadays. And in Brazil, it's the same, especially in politics between our current president's party and our former president's party, that people almost don't talk across those borders. So we're managing to do something very interesting in MATRIA right now. We are currently 360 women and growing every day with new women coming. And our main focus is to protect women's sex-based rights and protect the children's minors' rights to grow up free of harmful medical intervention. We would like, of course, to be fighting against other issues we do have in our principles that were against for the abolition of prostitution, against surrogacy, against pornography. But to be honest, since we are the only ones fighting against the trans ideology, we end up being mostly focused on that. And because we do understand, like all of you here, that once we lose that definition of women, we lose the ability to fight for anything else. So we are fighting on every possible front, which is very hard. One thing that's very strange is that things got very bad in Brazil without us having a single law that talks about gender identity. We are a very conservative country. Congress is very conservative. So I don't think we'd ever have approved laws that bring this concept in. But even so, everything came through our Supreme Court, other court decisions, and also medical bodies, the psychology medical council. And so the order of things was that first the government started with resolutions saying that what we call a person's social name should be accepted everywhere, meaning that you have one name in your documents, but if you choose a name from the other sex, this should be accepted and you should be treated by that name in the public system, in the education system. Then in 2018, our Supreme Court decided that you can officially change your document by complete self-declaration. So anyone can go to the notary and simply self-declare and change documents. And a lot of people do, but again, it's not even really needed. You don't need to do that for the government to treat you everywhere by the name and thus the sex that you think you are part of. Then in 2020, our Supreme Court made a very weird decision. They decided that as long as there isn't a law that criminalizes what they called homotransphobia, as if it's one thing and like the same thing, that they were deciding that homotransphobia should be equated to the law that criminalizes racism. This is a very strong law in Brazil because we've had 400 years of slavery and it's still a very complicated issue. But all of it is, in the end, unconstitutional because it's not up to the Supreme Court to create new crimes. In our penal code, the first article is that there is no crime that hasn't been previously defined in the code. And this obviously isn't there. And more than that, the Supreme Court hasn't defined what transphobia would constitute, like at all, where usually in the penal code, you have verbs that go with the crimes. To do this and to do that constitute the crime. So no one knows what transphobia would be, which means that trans activists keep accusing all of us of transphobia for anything. So if you say that you don't think that a man becomes a woman, they can go to the justice system and accuse you of a very serious crime that could end up with 2 to 5 years of prison. and fines and everything else. This case has never been finalized by the Supreme Court because both the government's general attorney and some other groups said that they had issues with this. They came and said, please reconsider for this and that and that. And they said everything that I'm saying here. And also that the decision could be a problem for freedom of expression, for women's spaces. And the Supreme Court never went back to analyze that. So it's not a case that is concluded, but still it has been used by other judges. So this has been very complicated. Everyone's very scared in Brazil of being criminalized. And this is used as a weapon for against women. Some of you may have heard of a case that became quite famous abroad too, of Isabella Sipa, a Brazilian feminist who ended up being the first Brazilian to have a political asylum in Europe since our military dictatorship ended in the mid-1980s. Because a high-profile politician who calls himself Erika Hilton, so a male that was elected in the women's quota as a politician, has been persecuting her for now almost 6 years, because when Hilton first was elected, she commented that she was very disappointed with the election results because the most voted for woman in Brazil was a man. Then it began, the persecution that hasn't ended yet, because even though the first case was closed, there's another case going on against her, and she's not the only one. We as MATRIA follow the cases of many women. There is one that also was reported by Redux about a cleaning woman in a university in the northeast of Brazil. She was simply doing her job and was in the female bathroom when a boy, clearly a boy, came in, and she told him this was the female bathroom. And he went to the specific services for women, the police station for women, to say he had suffered transphobia. And she's being prosecuted for the crime of racism, of transphobia. She lost her job. She was unemployed for 3 years, having kids because of that. Following this decision from the Supreme Court that anyone could self-identify, things got worse and worse, because then our National Justice Council decided through a resolution that people could choose where they would serve their prison sentences, and that judges could then change them from unit to unit. That means, of course, men and female prisons and never the other way around. And this, even though our constitution says that prisons should be separated by sex, but everything is being simply reinterpreted as sex, meaning gender identity. We are fighting very hard against this issue in prisons. We are constantly in touch with the female agents that work in prisons where there are men, and they describe the situation as hellish. We have finally managed to make the media talk a little bit about the prison in our capital, the Federal District, because there are currently at least 86 men, the last we checked, in that female prison. And they, of course, harass the other prisons, the female prisons, and they do not respect the female officers, because in Brazilian law, only female officers can work in the female prisons to prevent abuse. And so the officers keep having to ask anyway for male officers to come and help them, because there's just a force difference and they cannot deal with all those men there. We have a case before the Supreme Court right now about that. It hasn't started yet. They haven't analyzed our plea. But we have managed to have the union of the police officers to be accepted for an amicus brief in that case. And that's very important, because in everything that came prior to this, all of this was decided without ever hearing either the police officers or list of all the women who are imprisoned. Our Medical Federal Council last year decided that there could be no transition for under 18s. No puberty blockers, no hormones, no surgeries. This is being questioned by trans activists at the Supreme Court. And while it's still not decided, we do have, unfortunately, judges who have been decided on a case-to-case basis that minors can go on with their hormones, which is very sad. Through all of this, I have to say that we are still far behind with the media. The media in Brazil will not publish anything that has a different version that isn't trans women are women, it's children's human rights to transition. So, for example, we sent all the journalists a briefing about the CAS report when it was published, and not a single one spoke about it in Brazil. So we have a very hard barrier there to cross. We sometimes try to have things published abroad when possible, because it's one way to pressure Brazil to also talk about it when the international media talks about it. So I bring that plea to you, that all of you help speak about it, like follow us. I know that we don't often publish on Twitter in English because we already have so many other things to do. And here in Brazil, for some reason, that issue is mostly on Instagram. So to be honest, our big profile is on Instagram, not on Twitter. But I promise I'll try to tweet more in English so that all of you can also engage with it, because our government does hate international negative attention, and so that could help. So bringing me to our government, we have elections this year, president elections, and also state governor elections, senators, Congress, all that. So we are almost completing the 4 years of President Lula, who is considered left-wing. I don't know anymore, to be honest. I think we're all lost with all of that means right now. And it's been a complete disaster for us. The president has recreated what is called the women's ministry, but it's a male ministry, because it's trans. It's all there is to it. We have managed as MATRIA to talk to the two women's minister of those last 4 years, and they don't care at all. They say to our face that we are prejudiced, that trans women are women. They have, like Reem Al Salem had a visit scheduled to Brazil, I think in 2023. And 10 days before she was due to come, the government simply canceled without any explanation. We heard about it from her when she tweeted. And the civil society had prepared for that, had sent her input and everything. So we were very disappointed. And we kept insisting with the government, like, why was it canceled? When is she coming back? Until finally someone leaked an audio from the minister's aide, say the woman's minister aide, saying that they canceled it because the biggest trans activist group in Brazil showed her tweets from Reem Al Salem saying that under the guise of freedom of expression, she was actually a transphobe. That was with the first women's minister. When we had a meeting with the second one, we asked her, we said, it's very important that you invite again the special rapporteur. And she also has a very important work on an issue that is pressing in Brazil, which is the parental alienation law. I don't know if you know what that is. I think that the concept exists in other countries, but Brazil is the only country in the world that has a law that will change custody of a child almost immediately to the father. And it's usually used when the woman says that the father has been abusing a child, and then the father says, no, she's making that up. It's parental alienation. And the judge grants then the custody immediately. to the father. We have had many kids here murdered by their fathers after this happened. So it's a very pressing women's issue. And Rima Salam works on that very hard. She has published a report about this. She has sent letters to the government, which never replied. But all of this to say that her coming to Brazil didn't even have to do with trans. It was important for that reason. And so when we insisted with this second minister, please invite her, the minister said something very flippant, like, no one's forbidding her of setting foot in Brazil. And so we said, oh, okay then. And we as MATRIA invited her for an academic visit to Brazil, which just happened in early May. We organized a whole day of meetings with civil society for her, with women from all sorts of groups, women in prostitution, women who fight against sex trafficking, the mothers that are fighting against the parental alienation law, indigenous women, lesbian women, all of it. So yes, our government's very complicated right now, full of trans activists inside of it. We can see the results of that. We can see all that you can imagine and all that you know that's happening everywhere. Statistics are getting skewed because a man doesn't even need to have changed his documents. If he commits a crime and he then says that he's a woman, this is a crime committed by a woman. And all the consequences. We have had for the last 20 years, I think, racial quotas, but it's racial slash economic situation. So people who went to public school only, who did not have the means to go to a private school, because here in Brazil, public schools are not good quality at all, and people who come from Black families and thus have suffered all this weight of 400 years of slavery that still means that most Black people here are poor. There are rules for quotas for university, but this is enshrined in law. Most public universities since last year and a half, 2 years, have decided on their own to have trans quotas. And the trans quotas are the only ones who have no rules at all, because you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to prove that you come from a poor background. You don't have to prove, like people with disabilities. There are some quotas for people with disabilities. They have to have a medic proof that of their disability. You don't need anything. You just self-declare. And just this week, the University of Brasilia has received their first class with trans quota kids. And there are interviews with some of them, and they are just clearly middle-class kids with blue hair. So it's completely absurd. In some universities, this means that they are taking away places from the legal quotas to give to the trans quotas. Not everywhere. In some places, it's extra spots. But still, even though the public schools here are not good, the public universities are considered the best, but they have limited funding. And that means part of the funding is going for people who have no need of a quota. There's no proof that there's any need for that. Of course, that the public narrative here is very strong, that trans people are the most vulnerable in the whole entire world. Most of the facts that you hear everywhere and that other countries even reproduce, unfortunately, they were born in Brazil. We export trans fake news. So if you have ever heard that the trans life expectancy is 35 years old, no, it's not. It's absolutely not. This comes from a report by a trans activist group that in 2018 counted through the newspapers the deaths that they could find for trans people. And the average age of death of those people in 2018 was 35 years old, which, of course, the average age of death has absolutely nothing to do with life expectancy. You couldn't even calculate life expectancy for something a characteristic you don't have as birth, such as being trans. So Brazil is supposedly the country that most kills trans. That's not true. Brazil actually is considered in a lot of other reports as one of the best places with the most protections for trans people. So beware of all our Brazilian fake news. But this is to say that universities are implementing quotas based on that and saying we have a historical debt to that population that has such a low life expectancy. This is not to say that there isn't the persons that the people that we call travestis. Way before this trans wave started in Brazil, there has always been men in prostitution who are called travestis. They are a whole different story in the sense that it's usually poor Black homosexual boys who can get kicked out of their houses, will end up in prostitution, and there they are pushed to have silicone and present in this way because there's more market for that. Those people, they are marginalized and they need public policies. But first of all, they never said they were women. This wasn't the issue at all. Everyone knew travestis were men and there wasn't a problem there. And they are certainly not the ones getting quotas for university because they are on the streets getting prostituted and maybe haven't even finished school. So those who are getting in university through those quotas are just like very lost kids or people who are profiting, really profiting from the system. We help women who are being persecuted for transphobia almost daily. We get women coming to us being called by the police to go give testimony because someone complained about something they said on the internet. We have a support group for mothers of kids who say they are trans. We have a support group for the transitioners. We have started some cases of our own, as I said, about prisons, for example. We submit a lot of amicus briefs, as in the case of the resolution about transition of minors that is being questioned at the Supreme Court. We submitted an amicus briefs and to many others too. We try to do advocacy with Congress. We have appeared in 3 public hearings talking about all those issues, about bathroom issues, about prisons, and then in general, when Rima Salem was here, she was in a public hearing and we were too. It was very hard to get her to any meetings, to do anything, because the government itself did not engage with her at all. They pretended she wasn't even here. They didn't even reply to any of her official emails asking for meetings. We have proposed a law here in Brazil. Anyone can propose a law, and if you get at least 20,000 signatures in, I think, 1 month or I don't know, 3 months maybe, then the Senate has to appreciate it. So this has been going on. It's slow going, of course, but it's about guaranteeing that bathrooms, locker rooms, hospital wards will be preserved by sex for females. We now sponsor an amateur female football team because we saw them being attacked on the internet for transphobia because they were in a female championship, and at the last minute when the game was about to start, they saw that there was a male in the other team, and then they refused to play, and they were vilified everywhere. So we reached out to them, and after a while, we ended up sponsoring them. So they are now called the Lionesses MATRIA. It's very nice. There's a T-shirt with MATRIA on the back. We also did the first opinion poll in Brazil about all those issues. So we had to gather a lot of money from the nations to pay a company that does that for a living, that does opinion polls. And we found, of course, that the population is completely against allowing men to self-identify into women's spaces and public policies. So it was up to 80% of the population against men in prisons, in bathrooms, 78% against males in female sports, 89% were against using expressions such as people who menstruate, people who gestate. And that even amongst those who voted for the current president Lula in the last election, meaning that even on the quote unquote left, people do not agree with this. And this brings me to the last thing I want to comment on, which is what has been happening in the last 10 days here. That is actually a national peak trend, I think, I hope, because Erika Hilton, the same politician that I said was persecuted, a lot of women, including Isabella Sepa, who had to flee from Brazil, became president of the Women's Committee in Congress. And this made the whole country peak. We have only been talking about that for the last 10 days. And now there's an opinion poll about that was made, and 84% of the population rejects Hilton in that position. And finally, we have newspapers saying that there's a crack even in the left on this issue, because we usually everyone's called the far right, fascist. Anyone here who speaks about the issue is immediately labeled Bolsonarista, which is supporters of our last president. You know how that goes everywhere. So there's a little hope that things might change, especially since it's election year, and we are starting to hear from people close to the president that well, this issue is actually hurting the government. So we can only hope that the more they speak, the more they will hurt themselves, and help us show the country, that the government actually, that the population does not agree with that, that everyone knows that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and that it's absolutely not fair to have men in our spaces, in our laws.
What role do schools play in trans activism? Is there a curriculum that is used widely?
No, it's not something that is officially inside the curriculum, even though they keep trying for that. But we do hear of many teachers that on their own bring that up. But we also hear the other way around a lot from teachers who will come to us saying that they get accused of transphobia in the classroom, usually the richer schools, by students who will say that they are being transphobic for talking about sex, or that only women can get periods and things like that. And from schools, what we hear more is the bathroom problem, that the families, teachers, and even students come to us saying that boys are going into their bathrooms. Universities are already colonized, completely colonized. It's one of the spaces for where there's more persecution of women who simply know the reality of sex and want to talk about it. It's very, very violent with teachers, with students. So it's already forbidden to even study women anymore, because you will not get your work approved if you do not include trans women, even when you're talking about breastfeeding. No matter what you're doing, the pressure is really huge, and students who dare to say something, they suffer campaigns against them. We have had more than one suicide attempt here. And there was a student maybe 2 or 3 years ago who attempted suicide on campus in a wood. And it was a miracle that she was found in time, but she spent days in hospital with the tube, and it was very serious. And because it was her first year in university, it was her dream to go to that university to study what she was studying. And because of Instagram stories that she posted about women's spaces, this horrible campaign started. No one would form groups with her. People would harass her all the time, say that she should kill herself. She brought that to university many times, and they just didn't do anything. Even after her attempt, when the family and her went to speak to university, they said, "Oh, but you have to understand how what you posted hurt people."
I'm going to introduce Mara Accettura from Italy. She is our co-country contact from WDI Italy. So thank you very much, Mara, for being here, and over to you.
I really chose this subject, this issue, because it's happening right now in Italy, and it's about the so-called family in the woods case. I don't know if you are familiar with the case, because it has blown out of proportion. It has become a political issue, left versus right. I will start from the beginning. Back in 2021, this British-Australian couple, Catherine Birmingham and Nathan Trevelyan, decided to live off-grid in the wooded hills of Abruzzo near Palmoli. And off-grid means solar panels, a vegetable patch, chickens, a donkey, a horse. There are three kids who are an 8-year-old girl and 6-year-old twins. So grew up running around barefoot, learning at home with some kind of homeschooling, which was approved by the state, by the way. Going into town once in a while and meeting with other children. And the mother, in a letter that was published on several media a few weeks ago, she said, we wanted our kids to grow up free from pressure, labels, and the constant rush, and let them learn patience from the earth and freedom from the slow rhythm of the land. So they, nobody bothered this family for about 3 years. Then in 2024, the kids ate some wild mushrooms by mistake and ended up in hospital. So the investigation, so they got investigated. Social services and the juvenile court in L'Aquila, they show up and looked around. And they found the house was falling apart. There was no running water. There was not a proper toilet. There was a compost toilet outside. They didn't like this lack of formal school. The kids don't understand Italian. They found that they lacked the proper education. And to them, the kids were, neglected. So fast forward to November 2025, and the court suspends parental responsibility, take the kids away from dad, puts them in a foster home in Vasto, a little town nearby. So at first, the mom let the mom stay with the kids just to observe. The parents appeal, but the appeal was rejected. The family lawyer has tried several mediation attempts. The family has allowed a kind of a home teacher, I think twice a week. And initially they agree on some kind of renovation in their home, but it's clearly not enough for the social services, because the family anyway, they want to live off-grid and they claim an alternative lifestyle. And because of this, has not been reunited. Now, in March, the whole issue got worse because the court kicks Catherine Birmingham out of the foster home and says that she's not cooperating, she's hostile. The family has appealed again, begging to put back together. And we have to wait until, I think, May or June to know something. So right now, the dad, who was cut off at the start, can see the kids regularly, almost every day. He's now depicted like the best of dads because he's cooperating with the social services and trying to fix things. People are saying he might even get sole custody. And the mom, she started she started off living with the kids, and now she can only call the kids, no visits. At one point, the social services wanted to prohibit video calls, claiming that the kids were even more distressed by seeing their mother on screen. So the papers are full of, very heartbreaking description, kids screaming when separated, psychological breakdowns, lots of suffering. Even the local health authority wrote in a report that we need to keep the family routines and affection going and to stop the trauma of these kids getting worse, but nobody listened to them. Now, it's very interesting to understand how the mother has been treated in the story. Catherine Birmingham used to train horses, and then after a horse accident, I believe, she became a spiritual healer. She does energy readings, this kind of things. She clear up the energy in your house, or she reads your aura, etc. So in this story, she's either painted as a hippie or a modern witch. She's been demonized, and the social services have called her hostile, arrogant, symbiotic with the kids, and she's been called an obstructive mother. And that Italian phrase, obstructive mother, madre ostativa, you often hear it in parental alienation cases. It's the same wording. So all the experts are, a lot of experts have jumped in, and for instance, Massimo Ammaniti, who is a child psychiatrist, said that separate the kids from the mother and separate the whole family was a huge mistake, because the children have needs that must be respected. And he warned the damage from ripping off the mom bond apart, and the sidelining the dad will last way longer than any risk they saw in the original house. Then the psychiatrist on the family side Tonino can tell me, keeps saying that this family needs to be reunited, and that Catherine needs her dignity back because she has been humiliated. He calls her, a strong woman. She's certainly a leader, smart, and someone who needs understanding and not judgment. In one interview, he actually said, from my point of view, it is not possible to sever the affectionate bond between mother and children. And we should bring psychological expertise into play to accompany this family. And perhaps we can admit that what was missing was an empathetic accompaniment based on psychological and professional competence for the family. Now, feminists on the whole have condemned the separation of the family. And, even, Marina Terragni, who is country contact with me and is the National Children Ombudsman, went to Vasto a few days ago, and she saw the kids, and they were physically okay, but super agitated and clearly traumatized by the separation. And she called the whole removal disproportionate and said, we need to support the whole family and not to dismantle it. So after, months of this mess. We are completely stuck because no one knows when or how it will end. It feels like, you know, the bureaucracy has forgot humanity and doesn't know what actually is best for the kids. Now, you know, I think that some things needed to be corrected, but I think that the hands of bureaucracy and the court has been really harsh on this family. And, you know, of course, Italy being Italy, it has turned into a political war because our president Meloni and Salvini are actually defending the family. And a lot of people think that, you know, they are riding the wave of the justice referendum that is happening today and tomorrow. So, you know, there is a vested interest in supporting the family. And the left, on the other hand, mostly backs the social services and the court. So it's a strange situation. No, the whole thing, I want to say that has exposed a lot of cracks in how Italy, the Italian system, handles the child protection. And so on March the 11th, the center-right government passed a new foster care law specifically to stop another family in the woods case. So they are implementing a national registry for foster families, more oversight, stronger emphasis on keeping kids with their birth family whenever is possible, which means if the children are not, you know, stressed because, you know, traumatic experiences, you should help the whole family and not separate the family. And we will now know how many kids are in foster families, where are they and why, and for how long, because this is an unknown thing. So, you know, it's in a way, it's a strange story. It's maddening and it's heartbreaking. And it's about, you know, freedom, parenting, the state stepping in, bureaucracy gone wrong. To me, it feels that, you know, an overreach of than justice. I don't know what's the situation in other countries because, you know, this family, they live like, I don't know if there is a comparison in and what is the law in other countries, especially, you know, in the Anglo-Saxon culture, probably these off-grid families are more common. I think, I don't know if they are like the Amish, you know, like they live in the States. So this is the situation now. We don't know how it will end. I think that the Australian diplomacy has been involved, but they cannot overturn, you know, the decision of the tribunal. They have to go along with it. I think they are monitoring the situation, but at the moment they cannot do very much. And I don't know what will happen to this family, honestly.
And now Bernadette will help us. She will show Sally Wainwright's video because her talk was about how words matter in law. And she was referring how the Supreme Court in the UK leads the way for state law. As I said, this is her intervention in the special webinar that WDI held in the framework of the CSW that was happening last week in New York, but also there were online activities program. So we had this special webinar. I don't know whether the video is ready.
Sally Wainwright is from Scotland. She's going to talk about how words matter in law. The Supreme Court in UK leads the way for state law, or you could be more precise with words.
The For Women Scotland case about the meaning of sex in the Equality Act is a very, very good example of what Diane was just speaking about. And I'm going to come on to that in a minute. I think, to start by saying that the transgenderist project has been above all a war on language. The egregious harms that have been done by feeding unnecessary drugs to children or removing healthy body parts, the insult to women's dignity, privacy, security, are all only possible if you've already bought into the linguistic gymnastics that deny the basic truths. Because before any of those things that can take place, there has to be some level of acceptance that men can be women. Men can be women, it's true, I have to say, but only if you first redefine the meaning of the word woman to be an adult human female and any men who pretend to be women. Similarly, men can literally be lesbians, so long as you first redefine the word lesbian to mean women who are same-sex attracted and any heterosexual men who pretend to be women. And we see these same linguistic shenanigans in many other aspects of what was once normal speech. I always shudder, for example, when I hear that an event is inclusive, because I know that what that actually means is that it excludes women like myself who know exactly what a woman is. Last weekend, I went to a lecture by Caroline Criado Perez, and what was remarkable about it was that she just spoke, it shouldn't have been remarkable, but she just spoke about women and female bodies as if it was 15 years ago. She used normal language and assumed that everybody would know exactly what she meant without any explanations or apologies for using correct words. And at the end of the event, the organizer told us that the lecture was in support of a charity which works with people with endometriosis. I wonder what kind of people they could possibly have been. And just for good measure, the lecture was being hosted by the Edinburgh Medical School. How have we got to the point where even doctors don't know the difference between men and women? Coming now to the For Women Scotland case, it was essentially about statutory interpretation, which is what Diane was talking about in terms of how you interpret a treaty, and this is the statutory interpretation of law. And that is determining the precise meaning and application of the legislation. It's usually needed when laws are ambiguous or poorly drafted. And there are certain rules which are applied as well as an attempt to align the law with what the original parliamentary intent was. So very similar to what Diane was speaking about. In this case, the question was, what is the correct meaning of the words woman, man, and sex? Could women include men who live as women, as the Scottish government initially claimed? Though I have no idea how to live as a woman. I've been told often enough that I don't do it properly, so I don't see how a man can know. But anyway, never mind that. For Women Scotland challenged that definition in court, and on appeal won a ruling that the Scottish government had attempted to redefine the meaning of the word woman as set out in the Equality Act, and that doing so was outside the Scottish government's legislative competence. So briefly, this meant that the law in Scotland was again aligned with the Equality Act, which defines a woman as a female of any age. However, the Scottish government then made a second attempt to redefine woman, this time claiming that men with a gender recognition certificate constituted women under the Equality Act itself. And it was this argument that led to the Supreme Court case. One of the rules that the Supreme Court used to determine how legislation should be interpreted is the literal rule that states that words should be given their ordinary and natural meaning, which is exactly, again, what Diane was talking about. I'm going to quote some bits from the ruling. Equality Act states that the protected characteristic of sex refers to a man or a woman, and it then defines a woman as a female of any age. And a man as a male of any age. The judges concluded that this meant that the definition of sex in the Equality Act makes clear that the concept of sex is binary. A person is either a man or a woman or a man. Although the word biological does not appear in this definition, the ordinary meaning of these plain and unambiguous words corresponds with the biological characteristics that make an individual a man or a woman. These are assumed to be self-explanatory and to require no further explanation. Well, that's what we've always argued, isn't it? But apparently they do. The judges referred in their ruling to sex as recorded in a gender recognition certificate as certificated sex, which gives us a very useful alternative to the term that some people have previously used of legal sex. And they said that a certificated sex interpretation of the law would cut across the definition of the protected characteristics of sex in an incoherent way. And they described how this would mean that a woman was a biological female without a gender recognition certificate, or a biological man with a gender recognition certificate. So it's a mishmash. Some men are included and some women are excluded. And the judges went on to say, we can identify no good reason why the legislature should have intended that sex-based rights and protections under the Equality Act should apply to these complex heterogeneous groupings rather than to the distinct group of biological women and girls with their shared biology leading to shared disadvantage and discrimination faced by them as a distinct group. The judges were also concerned that a certificated meaning of sex would mean it could only be determined if you knew whether or not somebody had a gender recognition certificate, and that such a certificate is confidential, so you're not actually allowed to ask for it. However, the allowing a man to be called a woman or a woman to be called a man because they have a certificate gives us the ridiculous notion of a pregnant man. They would not be entitled to any benefits which are specified as being available to women, such as pregnancy or maternity benefits, which are for pregnant women and mothers, and they're not for pregnant people and parents. The Scottish government actually accepted that pregnant men would not be entitled to maternity and pregnancy benefits and rights. But apparently they thought that this was a price well worth paying to allow some fetishistic men access to women's spaces. The judges, however, concluded that since, as a matter of biology, only biological women can become pregnant, the pregnancy and maternity protection is necessarily restricted to biological women. References to a woman who has become pregnant or who is breastfeeding only make sense if sex has its biological meaning. And again, they use this same phrase. These plain, unambiguous words can only be interpreted coherently as references to biological sex, biological females, and biological males. And they also pointed out that if biological women with a gender recognition certificate were legally male, then those women would be excluded from protection when pregnant, notwithstanding a continued capacity to become pregnant. The Scottish courts at the earlier hearing had suggested that a way around this problem would be to give sex its biological meaning where necessary. So they were arguing that the Scottish court had said that sex should have its certificated meaning, except where that wasn't possible, like, for example, when you had a pregnant person where it had to refer to a woman. But the Supreme Court was having none of it. The judgment pointed out that other than in extremely exceptional circumstances, a word must have the same meaning throughout a piece of legislation, again, for the same reasons that Diane was talking about. Everybody has to be able to read a law and understand what it means. You have to know what a word means. You can't have a word in section 3 meaning something different than it means in section 43. And so the judgment said, by its nature, a variable definition is neither clear, constant, nor predictable. It is the opposite, in fact. It is also contradicted by the single definition of sex that fixes its meaning in the Equality Act. And finally, the Supreme Court addressed the question of sexual orientation, specifically the way in which the case affected lesbians. Yet again, the ruling demonstrated just how important the accurate meaning of words is. The Equality Act defines sexual orientation as being an attraction to the opposite sex, the same sex, or either sex. And so the judgment said a lesbian must therefore be a female who is sexually oriented towards other females. This is coherent and understandable. Those words again, coherent and understandable. Coherent and understandable on the biological understanding of sex. On the other hand, if a GRC were to alter the meaning of sex, it would mean that a biological male with a gender recognition certificate, so legally female, who remains sexually oriented to other females would become a same-sex attracted female. In other words, a lesbian. The court basically echoed what we had argued in the lesbian intervention by saying that such an interpretation, allowing men to call themselves lesbians, would mean that the concept of sexual orientation towards members of a particular sex is rendered meaningless. Although the For Women Scotland case was about the meaning of woman, man, and sex in the Equality Act, much of the discussion in the judgment seems to me to have a much wider application. I strongly recommend you all read it, actually, if you're at all interested, because it's written in a very accessible way and it's full of very useful arguments. I've only highlighted really a couple of the key issues, but I think they still illustrate why language is so important in the legal context as well as in day-to-day life. There's much more in the judgment which relates to the meaning of language. It's impossible to litigate, or even, if you ask me, to communicate, if there's not a common understanding of the meaning of words, and therefore also of the meaning of laws. It's essential that we keep that clarity in everything we say. The power of the transgenderist lobby has come from its ability to distort language. What you hear affects the way you think, like in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty said words have whatever meaning he chose to give them at the time. If you constantly hear men being referred to by women's names and pronouns, you come eventually to think of them as women. So we must always demand that language is consistent, ambiguous, and above all, accurate.